from your, okay, got it, and for taking time out from your lunch to listen in on the project we've done at Edinburgh University over the last year, and together with, in collaboration with Scottish Community and Development Centre. And I will quickly share my screen here so that we can, my screen sharing, yes. It's taking a bit of time. There we go. Amy, are you seeing my screen?
Yeah, Ingela, we're seeing your screen. That's perfect.
All right, wonderful. So over the last year, we did a large-scale project on childcare and well-being in the times of COVID, developing crisis-resilient care solutions, we called it. And what I want to say before we start, actually, when we started to put together this project 20 months ago, this was, we were quite naive about COVID. We thought COVID would be a little short period of a few months and then we would be back to normal. And obviously here we're sitting and we see in countries going back into lockdowns as we speak, which also means that the project developed in slightly different ways. And while we were focusing in the beginning, we thought we were focusing how people access emergency hubs and so forth. More and more, the project really became about how do families cope with this situation, how has it affected the well-being of children and their parents, and this is what I would like to speak to you about today. So what we aim to find out is how the closure of schools and childcare in these big two lockdown periods we had since spring 2020 and then again in winter 2021, how this affected families with children aged 12 or under. Why did we look at this age range? Because this is an age range where we felt that the closure of different settings, whether it was nursery schools or after school clubs or childminders or play groups or anything to do with the where children go out with school settings or the early learning settings, that this would affect these age groups particularly. And what we wanted to find out is how the experiences of lockdown social distances has impacted different types of families, dual earner families, families with key workers, single parent families, families with underlying health issues, families who were economically vulnerable, families with BME backgrounds, but also whether there were different experiences of COVID in rural and urban spaces. And as I said, what we wanted to learn is how the closure of both schools and childcare provision affected family well-being, with the focus on mental well-being. And ultimately, we want to learn how we can develop childcare policy and as a social infrastructure in Scotland post-COVID, both long-term, but also if there were new emergent situations arising. Now, why do I talk about childcare rather than the usual terms we use in this field, which would be either early childhood education and care or early learning and childcare? Now, what I would like to say from the beginning is focusing on care doesn't mean that I think education is not important or learning for that matter. I think it is very important. But the approach I'm taking here is that we have focused a lot on the educational component of early year settings for a while and possibly forgotten about the importance, how important care is in human beings' lives. And I think both very young children, the elderly, everyone in society. And also to think about the fact that no matter how we call these settings, whether we call them nursery schools or nursery classes or childminders or early learning or childcare or after school club, it doesn't really matter because children learn all the time. They learn every waking minute. They even learn when they're asleep. So we cannot prevent them from learning, whether we call something a learning setting or a childcare setting. However, children learn differently depending on the environment we create for them. And what is important to remember is no matter where they are, whether they're in school or in nursery school or in a private nursery or with grandma and grandpa or at home, in order for children to become confident, curious, and courageous learners, they need to feel secure and cared for and in an affectionate setting. So this is why this project focuses on the child care aspect, and also because this is something that takes place everywhere, in the family home or in non-familial settings, or we would hope it does, or this is what we are trying to support. So this is our focus here. Without taking a moral stance or some kind of institutional perspective, we just wanted to focus on what happens, actually almost in a bit of a gloomy experiment, what happens when non-familial childcare settings close, how do families experience that? So we had 3 work packages in this project. The first one was we conducted 50 qualitative interviews with parents of young children here in Scotland, both in rural areas and in urban areas, to understand better the experience of COVID lockdowns for different families. Then we conducted a quantitative data analysis using as much kind of high quality, robust, representative data we could find on how COVID had impacted families, although we had to find that there was not that much data on how families dealt with their childcare challenges and arrangements during COVID lockdowns. So we drew quite a lot on our qualitative interviews there, but we found more about well-being in the quantitative data. And lastly, we did a series of local co-production workshops in the Highlands to date, with local stakeholders, with parents, with community groups, with policymakers and third sector organizations to discuss ideas and possible solutions for local childcare provision. Now, today, I will not talk about our third work package simply out of time constraints. So I will focus on the findings from the qualitative and the quantitative research so that we have time to discuss a bit more. And also just to say, we had a large number of project partners on this project, for example, the Early Learning and Childcare Directorate from the Scottish Government or Public Health Scotland, but also Catanach has been one of our partners on this project. Now, just to remind everyone, and this is again data from our interviews, and you will know this all yourself because you're in the field, that of course already before the COVID pandemic broke out, childcare arrangements of families were complex. Yeah, they have always been complicated. What we could find is that most of the families we interviewed had used some kind of formal childcare for their children before the pandemic. And only very few families relied solely on formal childcare, meaning early learning and childcare settings. So most families had multiple arrangements in their week that often brought together different providers, but also informal care was very important. And we saw some slight differences, so particularly for rural parents, childminders were particularly important because there's less availability of larger nursery settings. And the importance of grandparents, of course, you will be familiar with that, so I'll just skip through that. As I said, the arrangements were quite complex and dynamic. What we also found, if families had less complex arrangements, particularly if there was no childcare outside of the family, neither by family member, extended family, or by formal provision, this usually meant that mothers were working less, either not at all or working part-time. So there is a clear link between whether families use or puzzle together different childcare arrangements and the employment patterns in the families, particularly from the parents. And you can see some quotes over there, but I just skipped through. I think you will receive these slides, so I'm not going to talk about everything on these slides, but just please feel free to have a look at them. And if you have any questions or any comments about anything, you can always contact me, but also have a look at our webpage, which I'll show you at the end. Now, what happened during COVID? Obviously, we had lockdowns and social distancing, so we focused on these lockdown periods, and there it was really quite clear, maybe not so surprising, that 4 out of 5 of our families, so that is 40 of the 50 families we did research with, had no support in helping looking after their children or anything to do with their family organization during the lockdowns. So 4 out of 5 families were on their own. And when I say families, I don't necessarily mean a mommy, daddy, child. It can be whatever the households we interviewed defined themselves to be families. In some cases, it was single parents living with the grandparents of the children and the children. Often that had to do with arranging themselves and to make a work-life balance possible. We had families living apart where there were separated parents of the children. So we use the term families not to describe a very specific type of family, but where the children are at home. What we found also is that the groups that were most affected by lockdowns, that found it the hardest to cope with, were households that had 2 or more children, particularly when the children were of different age groups. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Where the parents were working and not furloughed, where parents had underlying health issues, and one-parent families. They found the lockdown situation really quite challenging. We saw that there were some positive experiences during the lockdowns, that families enjoyed being able to bring in creativity and explore education together with their children, doing extracurricular activities. We have actually, from our quantitative analysis, there was 1 in 4 of the mothers felt that their relationship had improved with their children during being able to spend time with their children, and fathers felt too. But we also had some issues, and that has to do with family well-being, where we unfortunately have to see that this last 18 months have been really hard on families with young children. And when it comes to the parents, particularly, it is the stress, the exhaustion, the lack of self-time and absence of routine that has really meant that there has been quite a serious dip in mental well-being in most in many parents during this period, not in most, but in many. So the risk or the propensity, so to speak, to have mental health issues rose starkly during this period. So what is interesting, that the logistical challenges for families during COVID became of a very different kind, of course. Everyone was stuck in the house, in the same space, but somehow had to organize themselves, particularly those who had to work at the same time, who have homeschooling for some children, who tried to entertain younger children. And so families came up with quite intricate daily routines, where one parent would get up at 5 in the morning to work until 2, and then while the other parent looked after the children, and then they swapped over. So they did various rota systems, which is of course something that works for a while, but when you do that for almost a year, it is very exhausting. And again, what the parents told us again and again and again was this non-stop of doing everything at the same time, 12, 14 hours a day, and then up the next day to do this again. What we also found was that those parents who felt that it was not possible to both work and look after their children at the same time, and had to either stop working or reduce their working hours, this also had quite a serious effect on their mental well-being on average. So the main point that the parents told us was the challenge was to balance the many various roles that parents were faced with during their daily lives, being a parent, being a carer, being a teacher, protecting the children from COVID, which was creating anxieties and difficulties, as well as also having work-related roles, the increased domestic work, everything coming together. Another issue was to try new routines, finding new routines, because our lives are quite structured through the school day, through the social clubs the children have, through the work day, through the nursery day, and suddenly all this fell away and the families had to organize themselves. And what we found is those families who managed to come up with a suitable routine on a daily basis, they fared better than those who struggled a bit with that. Interesting also, we found that the role of employers for those who still were working was very important in helping create better well-being for families. If the employers were understanding and worked together with the parents and with their childcare needs, that worked better. But if they didn't, that created stress. And unfortunately also noticed there was quite a gendered aspect of this, that employers seemed to be more understanding that mothers had caring responsibilities and a bit less so that fathers did, unfortunately. Now, this is the last thing more or less I want to say about parental well-being, because then I want to talk about children's well-being. But what we can see here on this graph, so this is a complicated graph in the sense that the higher the curve goes, the greater the risk of mental illness like depression or anxiety and these kind of things. So this the higher the worse, so to speak. And what we can see here, this is women's graph, is that during the lockdowns, women's mental well-being decreased. And we can also see that for fathers here, decreased, men in general and women. But what we see is that for women, it decreased a lot more than for men. And what we can see that this particularly where mothers, but also fathers had more than one child, where it became really stressful and difficult during the 2 lockdowns. So these are, from a statistical point of view, very strong, stark demonstrations that the lockdowns were, unfortunately, for a large part of families, quite difficult. And from our qualitative interviews, which you can see here in the kind of salmony pink colored side, what we also see, the trickiest bit was the lack of self-time for parents, the interruption of routine, and the absence of the informal network. So the experience that the family networks, friendships and so forth that normally are there to help and support families and buffer them, how fragile they suddenly became during COVID, because people had to self-isolate because they couldn't meet these kind of things. Homeschooling, which we're not going to talk so much about today, but that was another big stressors for family. And also that we found that women shouldered the lion's share of the care, the homeschooling, and the domestic work during the COVID period. I will jump over this because I don't have so much time about this. But again, I think the main point I want to really bring home here about how parents experienced the lockdowns is that I think there is maybe a kind of misconception in the public that because many people were working from home, it would then be easier because then they can do everything at the same time. Now, a really strong message I would like to bring home is we cannot do everything at the same time all the time. We cannot, be at the, I say the same place, but to perform 2 different roles and functions at the same time, it is not easy, and it creates a lot of stress. And a lot of parents felt they were being pulled apart if they were trying to help one child with homeschooling, the other child who was maybe younger was shouting in the corner, the phone was ringing, then there were these online meetings at the same time. The real message I think we need to remember is home working, while it seems to be helping to balance work and family lives, is possibly a poison chalice, because it in the long term has for many and can the risk of mental health issues around stress, anxiety, depression is actually quite strong. So this is, I think, a key message to take home. Now, of course, what we also wanted to see is how the situation affected children. Now, we did not conduct interviews with children during our project. And one of the reasons was that this was a so-called rapid response project, and we needed to be able to get access quickly, and there's a lot more complicated ethical considerations about interviewing children and to do that online and so forth. So we didn't go there in this project. We were hoping to find more quantitative data, but we're unfortunately disappointed that we had only data for children's mental health for children aged 5 to 11, and so not for younger children. However, we did have quite rich stories from our families who also had younger children, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So what can we say about children's mental health? A bit similar to that of the parents. So their mental well-being, on average, there was a risk of mental ill health during both of the lockdowns as well. Contrary to the parents' one, that was stronger. So children experienced the first lockdown as harder, on average, and the second, they seem to have built up more resilience, and so the negative effects were a bit less, while we see on the side of mothers, the second one, they were a lot more exhausted, and the risk of mental health issues increased in the second lockdown. And difference, what we also find is that for girls, it was particularly emotional well-being that became poorer during the lockdowns compared to boys, while boys had worse conduct problems. And I think this is an interesting point, that maybe the way girls and boys are socialized, that they react and act out differently, while girls might be internalizing issues and challenges and feelings. Boys act out more in that sense. We also found that children from single parents households reported poor well-being. However, this is not necessarily COVID related. This is something we also find in other circumstances. Now, another really important point here is that children's well-being is strongly related to parental well-being. And I think this is a key message to take away. If we want to improve children's well-being, we need to also look after their parents, and I think particularly the mothers, because families are ecological systems. They react to each other. They, usually they care for each other, they love each other. If the parents are stressed, the children get stressed. If the children are not well, the parents are concerned. So making sure that children are well, we also need to make sure that their parents are well. I won't focus so much on the school-age children's experience, but what we found in our qualitative interviews is that the younger children seem to be more able to adapt to the new situation of social distancing, staying at home, not going to nursery. They were quite happy being with their parents, actually. But it has long-term effects as well. So I'm talking here about the children below the age of 5, but also very young children who often didn't even know any different because they were born just before or during the COVID period. But there have been some noticeable behavior changes, particularly in the young children's. And I'll talk a bit more about that. We have some nice quotes here, or maybe not so nice. So some really key issues with the very young children, and you will notice that, I'm sure, in your different settings and in your interaction with family and children, is that for young children, the COVID situation of social distancing, and particularly with less social interactions than children normally have, became the new normal. So children interact and behave differently, both with other children, and I'm talking here really about young children aged 2, 3 years old, 1 year old. They are more suspicious and more distant to other people, even to their own family members. Yeah, as it says, very young children can start getting a bit funny and upset around adults. They often could not really understand during COVID why they were not allowed in the play park, why they were not allowed to see their friends and go to the nursery. So this created tensions in the families and tantrums. And they often became more needy or more demanding on their parents. That's what the parents told us, that they wanted to have full-time, everyday attention, which is understandable in that situation as well. So I'm getting to my last 2 slides because I want to leave time for discussion. What can we learn from these findings that we've collated in our project for so potential lessons for early years practitioners? And I think the most important thing, really, and I'm sure that is something you have experienced in your everyday practices with and experience with children and their families too, is to acknowledge that this last year and a half has created new family realities. Yeah. So for children in particular, how social distancing and particularly the reduced social interactions have become the new normal for really young children, meaning that when children start in new settings, being it early learning, childcare settings with childminders, play groups, in any of these settings, there may be more separation issues, because they've just not had that experience of being with anyone else but with mommy and daddy and their siblings, if they have siblings. Yes, they've had less experience often in sharing and turn taking and playing in groups. many children might be on a different level in their developmental milestones than they might have been otherwise. Again, as we do know that early year settings are very important and helpful in helping children in develop some of these milestones. So it really then differences between different families might become starker. Some children, when they are 2, 3, they might have a lot more extensive vocabularies than others, for example. So these are things that probably need to be taken, well, not probably, that need to be taken into account in early years practice now following COVID. Important also, children have missed key transition events and milestones. So we are putting so much emphasis on the importance of creating good transitions for children from the family home into settings, from nursery school into school and so forth. And there's a lot of important things in a child's life that many of the children have just simply missed: celebration, nativity plays, having, you know, moving school year days when you go and visit your new class. Yeah. The other thing that's really important is that digital technology has also become the new normal in very young children's lives, partly because families had no way else of coping. When parents had to work, they did put their children in front of the TV or the internet. They expressed a lot of guilt to us in the interviews, but there was no other way for many. Part of it because the digital technology was used for homeschooling and also for early learning. And part of it because digital technology was the only means of connecting with family and friends. And these young children have now grown up in an enhanced digital world, much more than generations before. And that's part of their daily lives. Now, it creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities. It makes us needing to think about, what does child-centeredness mean in a digital world? When in a digital world, it's not tactile, we don't touch each other, we're not communicating, we're communicating in different ways. How can we make that child-centered? And I'm not just talking about, you know, making it safe and secure, that they don't go on sites that are not suitable for children. I really mean in terms of interaction and learning process. It's important to remember that digital services are less personalized, and that might be harder for children that have additional needs. But as I said, it might also create opportunities when children in a very young age learn how to use these resources and be able to connect and also access more learning resources or than they had before. What I think is probably something we need to think about is how to create more group and interactive play, because people have been quite isolated, particularly the children. Outdoor play, I think, is very important. What parents told us in the interviews was how extraordinarily important outdoor space became during lockdowns. And I think this is an opportunity to be used, that people seem to have spent a lot of time outdoors when they could. And I think really there is a need for more social and fun events for children, because a lot of children didn't have that much fun over the last year. This is something to remember. We also need to acknowledge that family realities have changed for parents during these last 18 months. And as you know, the interaction with parent is also important to create a good environment for the children. There have been different stressors for parents than there are normally. And as I can only emphasize this again and again, that parents are extremely exhausted on average after these last 18 months. COVID has exacerbated underlying vulnerabilities for families, like financial insecurity, when there's health issues. As you all know, it is very difficult to access the NHS for anything else than COVID at the moment. The isolation has been difficult for some families, particularly for single parent families, and so on. So this needs to be taken into account, different realities after this last 18 months. Parents have also missed out on key transition events. Yeah, when their children, you know, to take the video or the picture of the nativity play, to walk the child to nursery and wave them off. Parents have been left outside the gate a lot because of COVID. You know that there's less interaction with the parents coming into the settings because of COVID. It also leaves parents with anxieties, might them feel a bit cut off and not engaged. So we need to think of ways of engaging parents a bit more again. And I think a very important point to make sure we don't moralize and be aware that also parents working from home, they actually might be in need of extended early learning and childcare hours for their children because of the challenges they are dealing with. So rather than saying, oh, they work from home, so the child shouldn't be here until 5 or 6 in the evening, maybe this is really what families need to have a bit of respite in organizing their lives after period. Now, as a last slide, what I also wanted to point out is to be kind to each other and ourselves, in the sense that realities for the professionals and practitioners working in early learning and childcare settings have also changed during this period. First of all, because every one of us has also experienced COVID, and early years staff have the same experiences as other families, that of challenges, exhaustion, and so forth. So this is one thing to take into account. Secondly, early years staff have had to grapple with new health and safety guidelines, how to implement it, how to deal with that, and also to accommodate the different behavioral patterns of children that now come in and might need a lot more attention, who might be more clingy, who might be more insecure, and so forth. So again, something to take into account. I would say, though, there is also the potential that since families are a lot more used to, and every one of us is lot more used to using online tools, this could be a tool and an opportunity to connect with families in a way that we weren't able to do before. People are quite used now to do team calls or Zoom calls. It might make, in some circumstances, might make things easier as well. Providers also live in new realities. Again, providers are people too. They have had the same experiences as all of us. They might be exhausted. They might have had difficulties. They might have been grappling with trying to work, keeping their nurseries open while having young kids or elderly parents or relatives to look after. We all have had the same challenge. Providers have the challenge to needing to implement new and very fast changing health and safety guidelines, while at the same time also implementing the 30-hour entitlement. So big jobs happening at the same time as many providers are grappling with financial viability and sustainability issues. And this is particularly in rural areas where it's always been quite tricky to run a nursery or run a child-minding business because of the number of children and distances and so forth. So again, something to keep in mind. But again, also to think that online working can be a tool and an opportunity, for example, to connect different settings, different services for planning and management. Maybe we don't all have to come in at 6 p.m. in the afternoon. If we need to do a planning meeting, we could do it online, and also to connect with families. And I think the last point, which our project really brought home very starkly, if we didn't already know it before, is to acknowledge and be aware how incredibly important childcare services are. And I mean with childcare, really everything. And schools, in a sense, they also provide care. How important childcare, early learning, and school settings are as a social infrastructure for society, because unfortunately what we learned during lockdown, while lockdowns were important in order to contain the virus, the COVID virus, and save lives, it was also a real tricky, challenging situation for society. So to make sure that now that we are trying to get back to a new different form of normal, to make sure that planning and providing early years services is at the center of community planning, of policy plans, and conversations with the government too. Thank you very much for listening. Amy, I overran here a bit. I apologize for that.
That's okay. If you want to stop sharing your slides, Ingela, then you'll be able to see everybody.
Yes, here we are.
Fab. Okay, thank you so much, Ingela. We haven't got so much time for questions, but I think it was worth it because that was so fascinating, and I know it must resonate with all of you. And just to let you know, Ingela, Raymond, who works for one of our grantee organizations, has said that it totally chimes with their experiences of of what they've seen. And that and then he also commented that the out of school care sector is nationally on its knees, as you've kind of referenced before. And he's also said, you know, it's important to highlight that childcare is not just part of our social infrastructure, but it's part of our economic infrastructure as well. So those were his 3 comments. So maybe his microphone is broken, so he can't verbally contribute, but that's what he said.
Yeah, Raymond, I agree with you completely there, of course, and I know about the after school care situation as well. I just wanted to try to focus more on the early years here, but it is a very tricky issue, and of course it is part of our economic survival even. I mean, if we don't get childcare into the center of attention, I think, again, what I want to emphasize a lot, it is not possible to expect parents with young children to work from home and to provide quality childcare for their own children. I mean, this is what we've tried to fight for since for over 100 years. It is actually not possible, and those parents